All right. Hey, what's going on? So welcome back to AP Gov. We're gonna kind of kick it off with Unit 5. So this is the very last unit you'll see before we start AP testing review. A lot of this is going to cover voting rights and voting behavior. So by the time we finish these two slides, you'll be able to trace how voting rights have expanded over time, especially through constitutional amendments, and you'll be able to identify and compare the four main models of voting behavior before we kind of conclude with these two slides. All right. Here we're kind of looking at the learning objectives that we need to understand before we dive into the content, and College Board, and really me, but College Board as well, wants you from here, right, to know how to describe voting rights and the protections of voting rights in the Constitution and overall legislation. And also, you need to be able to describe different models of voting behavior. I think these are extremely pivotal because on the AP exam, you have to be extremely precise and specific. You cannot be vague concerning voting behaviors, all right? So just saying something like amendments gave people voting rights isn't going to cut it on the AP exam. You need to know which amendment, what it did, and why it matters. So keep this standard in mind as we kind of dive through the content, all right? All right. So you'll see voting protections. And we'll kind of start building, your amendment knowledge, because the expansion of voting right in America didn't happen at once, right? It happened in waves or through tiers, right? Usually after major political struggles. So the 14th Amendment, you're kind of looking at it right here. This happens in 1868, right? This is your foundation, right? It grants citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the United States, right? Including formerly enslaved people, right? So now here's something important to understand. The 14th Amendment doesn't directly give anyone the right to vote. What it does establish is equal citizenship and equal protection under the law, right? That matters because it becomes the legal basis for challenging discriminatory state laws for decades to come, even now, right? So think of it as like our constitutional floor or our foundation to this unit, okay? All right, so we get the 15th Amendment. This happens in, I believe it was 1870, right? And this goes a lot, this takes the 14th Amendment and it expands it further, right? So it explicitly says the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude, right? What you'll notice is women still don't have the right to vote, so keep this in mind, all right? This is a big deal because on paper, it's the first time the Constitution directly protects black men's right to vote, right? But here's where you need to apply some critical thinking skills, right? Passing an amendment and enforcing the amendment are two very different things, right? Southern states immediately, right, they begin finding workarounds. So think about when this amendment is passed, the South at this time is still heavily entrenched in Jim Crow, right? So they're trying to find loopholes to avoid this, right? So they have poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, white primaries, and just outright violence against black people or black men. The 15th Amendment protected black men's right in theory, right? While Jim Crow blocked it in practice for nearly another century, so another 100 years after it's passed, right? And then we get the 17th Amendment right here. Um, this came about in around 1913 and 1914. It's it's very different in character from the 14th and 15th Amendment because it doesn't expand who can vote. It changes how we vote for U.S. senators, right? So before 1913, state legislators chose senators, like states chose senators, basically, right? The 17th Amendment shifts that to a direct popular vote by the people. So after 1913 and the 17th Amendment, the people get to vote on who becomes a senator, right, for their state, right? This is huge. Like, I believe it's a huge monumental shift in the country because it makes the Senate more democratically accountable, right? Senators now answer to voters or their constituents, right, not to state political machines. So compare it to the electoral college for the presidency, right? We still use it. We still use it as an indirect method there, and you can see how the 17th Amendment represents a move towards more direct democracy in one branch while the others remain indirect. Okay? All right. So, voting protections and the rights. All right. We come back to women finally getting the right to vote through the 19th Amendment, right? This is 1920, right? This amendment comes after more than 70 years of organized activism, right? The Seneca Falls Convention was in 1848, and when the Seneca Falls was finally passed, it roughly doubled the size of the electorate overnight. It's worth evaluating the limits here too. So this is important for you all. So to kind of keep this in the limits of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment helped white women most immediately, right? Many black women in the South still faced Jim Crow barriers, much like black men did, right? So the amendment was a major milestone, but it didn't solve everything for everyone equally, okay? And then you get to the 24th Amendment, kind of piggybacking off the 19th, right? And this is the mid 1960s. It abolished poll taxes in federal elections because poll taxes weren't an accident, right? They were deliberate tools designed to price poor voters, and especially black voters in the South, out of participation or just out of voting completely. When they eliminated poll taxes, it was significant, but notice the limitation, you all. The 24th only applies to big federal elections. The Supreme Court later extended it to state elections, like in Harper versus Virginia in 1966, right? But the amendment itself had a major gap, right? And then from there, you get the 26th Amendment, right? So this lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. So the political context here is extremely critical for you all to know. This was the height of the Vietnam War. Young men were being drafted, at 18, but couldn't vote for the officials sending them to war, which is kind of a crazy concept when you think about it, right? The argument is simple, in my opinion, and it's hard to refute. If you're old enough to die for the country, you're old enough to vote in it, right? But funny enough, lowering the voting age hasn't dramatically increased youth turnout even to this day, right? Young voters still turn out at lower rates than older voters. And this is going to become extremely relevant when we get to the next page, okay? So when we taking these things together, these six amendments tell a very clear story about our country. American democracy has repeatedly been pushed and coddled, to live up to its state ideals. Rights weren't granted generously, and they were fought for by many groups of people throughout the country's history. Okay. All right. So we'll look at voting models and voting behavior. This right here tells us who can vote. All right. These models help explain why people vote the way they do. There are also four models on this slide set that we're going to talk about. And for the AP test, you all have to be able to define them, compare them to each other, and apply them to real world examples. Okay. All right. So let's look at rational choice really quick right here. Rational choice voting says that voters are essentially self-interested actors or self-interested people. They look at the candidates, they assess which one will benefit them personally, whether it be policy, socially, economically, et cetera, right? And then after they assess that, they vote accordingly, right? It treats the vote like I like to call it like a rational consumer making a cost benefit calculation, right? The strength of this model is that it feels intuitive and explains a lot of economic voting. The weakness of this model, of the rational choice voting model, is that it assumes voters have complete, accurate information and that they always act in their own interest, both of which are questionable assumptions in reality, all right? And then as we look at retrospective voting, right, it's voters who are looking in the past or looking backward. They evaluate the track record of whoever is in power and then they make a judgment, right? Did things go well or not is a question they ask. If the economy was strong, right, unemployment was low and people felt secure, the incumbent party or the party that's already in office gets rewarded. But if things were hard or things were rough, unemployment was high, then voters hold them accountable by voting them out. The key phrase political science use here is that it's a referendum on the past, right? Compare this directly to rational choice. Rational choice is about projected or future personal benefit, while retrospective is about collective past performance, right? So rational choice is about the future, retrospective is about the past. Both are backward looking in different ways, but retrospective focuses on the record in the office specifically, okay? All right. Let's look at perspective voting here. And one, well, maybe two major key takeaways from perspective voting is that you all kind of have to know that it's essentially the forward looking counterpart to retrospective, right? So, where retrospective acts, how did they do? Perspective acts, what will they do, right? Prospective voters are weighing campaign promises, different policy proposals, and vision for the future. They're betting on potential rather than judging a record, right? So this model is especially relevant for challengers who do not have, a record to run on. They're asking voters to imagine a future under their leadership. Okay, so now here's a comparison worth looking into for the AP exam. Retrospective and perspective are often presented as opposites, but in practice, voters use both simultaneously. You might think the current administration's handling of inflation was bad, that's retrospective, and this challenger's economic plan sounds better, that's perspective, right? And both thoughts inform your vote or who you're going to vote for. All right. So on the other hand, we get straight ticket voting, right? So this operates on a completely different logic, right? The voter isn't really evaluating individual candidates at all. They're expressing party loyalty. They pick a party and vote for every candidate affiliated with that party from top to bottom on the ballot, right? This is driven by strong party identification, different ideological alignment, and trust in the party brand over the person or the individual or the candidate, whatever you want to call them, right? The implication here is significant. In a straight ticket election, a weak candidate in a strong party can still win just by being on the right ticket. Contrast this with rational choice, right? So if we take this straight ticket voting, and we look at rational choice, right? The contrast is that rational choice, assumes and evaluates each candidate individually. Straight ticket just evaluates the party. Okay. Let's see. Here's a quick framework to remember for all four. Rational choice is what's best for me. Retrospective is how did they do. Perspective is what will they do, and straight ticket is who's my party, right? So if you can remember those four key frameworks for each model, then you'll be great. All right. All right. So we're going to transition into voter turnout in notebook page 36. All right. Okay. Let's look at some of these voter turnout factors. All right. Structural barriers, right? This is very, very important that you all know this. They are external rules that shape how easy or hard it is to vote. And this is where states come into play and become really important because elections in America are largely held at the state level. The experience of voting can look radically different depending on where you live. Voting in California looks very different than voting in Alabama, all right? Consider the range. Some students have automatic voter registration 2 weeks early of voting, all right? And that means some states, I don't know why I said some students, but I mean some states have automatic voter registration. But they have this 2 weeks early of voting. They can vote by mail or same day registration. But then you have other states that require like photo IDs. They have limited polling hours, few early voting locations, and make absentee voting very difficult for people, right? What you'll see in more progressive states like out west or up north, they have a wider range of access to vote versus southern states, it's a lot more limited, all right? Now, both are legal under federal law. So you can, the South can do what they do, and the North can do what they do, or the West can do what they do, right? The result is that the structural ease of voting, right, varies significantly across state lines. Voter ID laws are worth discussing specifically here because they're highly contested, right? Supporters argue they prevent fraud, while critics of this argue there is little evidence of widespread fraud and significant evidence that strict ID requirements disproportionately burden low income voters, elderly voters, and minority voters who are less likely to possess qualifying ID. All right. And then you get this thing called political efficiency that I really want to talk about. So, the best way to frame political efficiency is it's a person's belief that their vote actually matters, right? They believe the political system is responsive to people like them. They have high internal efficiency, means they feel politically capable. And then through high external efficiency means you believe the government is actually listening to you, right? When both are high, people vote. When people feel like the game is rigged and their vote doesn't count, right? Or politicians don't represent their interests anymore, you get disengagement and you get low voter turnout, right? This is especially important for evaluating why certain communities have persistently lower turnout. It's not always apathy, it's often a rational response to history having your political power marginalized, okay? All right. We look at demographic characteristics, right? And it's important that we look at it because it is extremely important. Because it is one of the most powerful predictors of voter turnout. And the AP exam expects you to know the patterns. Age is the biggest one, right? Older voters, particularly those 65 and up, turn out at dramatically higher rates than younger people, especially those between 18 and 29. So you're wondering why? Because older voters have more stable routines, more established community ties, and more practice with civic participation, and frankly, more at stake in policy areas like Social Security and Medicare that directly affect them, right? Education and income are closely linked as well because higher levels of education correlate with higher turnout, not because educated people are better citizens, but because higher education tends to produce greater political knowledge, more exposure to civic norms, and there's more access to resources that make participation easier. Income works similarly, right? Wealthier individuals have more flexibility to take time off to vote. They have more access to transportation and more resources to navigate complex registration systems, right? But then race and ethnicity are major factors because they need to be understood in a lot of contexts, not as what I like to call inherent characteristics, but the more so products of history and structure. Communities that have faced systemic disenfranchisement underrepresentation and hostile voting laws like Jim Crow laws have lower political efficacy on average, right? Which depresses people and has lower turnout. All right, and so here we have election type, right? It's kind of a clean, straightforward factor. Presidential elections turnout is consistently higher than midterm turnouts, often by about 20%, right? This explanation is media attention, perceived stakes, cultural salience. The problem this creates is real. Midterm elections determine control of Congress, governorships, and state legislatures. All right. However, they're decided by a much smaller and older and wider electorate than presidential elections. Here's just some data you can look at. This between 2010 and 2018, showing some midterm elections and the general election. All right. All right. Let's look at some other factors, right? Candidate characteristics. These matter more than political science once assumed, right? Charisma, right? Perceived authenticity, leadership qualities, and I like to say personal narratives all influence voters who may be less driven by pure policy or party, right? A lot of times these people are more drawn to the individual on the ballot rather than their policies, right? I got this picture here of Barack Obama because he was really good at the other factors, right? Extremely talented at it, right? That's why presidents or candidates spend enormous amounts of money on image, storytelling, and debate performance, right? And then this thing, issue salience, right, is about what's front in your mind, right? When gas prices are high, kind of like right now, economic issues dominate, again, like right now. When there's a major crime in this news, criminal justice becomes salient. Candidates who align with voters on the issue that feels most urgent, at a given moment, have a structural advantage, right? Regardless of their position. As we all know, religion is extremely powerful predictor of voting. You already know Christians more aligned with the Republican Party or evangelical Christian, right? Catholic voters tend to be a bit more split, right? So religion is a major factor in the other factors, right? And then demographic identity, right? Age, gender, race, ethnicity, etc., right? A young black woman in a southern state is likely to see healthcare policy, voting access, criminal justice reform through a very different lens than an older white woman in the Midwest suburb, right? There's a difference in perspective on those things. All right? All right. That's a wrap for notebook pages 35 and 36. So to kind of lock it in, right? Know your 6 amendments. Know what each one specifically did and who it affected. Know your 4 voting models and be ready to compare them, right? Know the factors affecting turnout, whether it be structural, demographic, and individual, and be able to use evidence to support claims about them, right? All of that stuff is going to be fair on exam day, okay? All right, next time we will dive into political parties. Alrighty? Okay.